All right, guys, we are going to start LT3. I've posted a link to the LT3 notes packet if you're an A student and doing this Thursday at home. I didn't have those copies for you yesterday in class, and so you can do one of two things. You're welcome to, it's not a long lecture today. If you have a printer at home, you're welcome to print your own notes packet or take notes digitally. The other option would be if you want to wait until you come to class on Friday, I'll give you a notes packet and you can come back and watch this video. I'm really fine with either. So it's totally your choice. Okay, so here we go. In the intro section, so LT3 is all about tissues. And so when we talk about tissues, we're talking about, and some of you have learned this and you remember this, this is like the hierarchy of what makes up what. So a whole bunch of cells working together for a common function make up tissues. And then if you remember, tissues working together for a common function create an organ, organs working together for a common function make an organ system, systems working together make an organism. This is that kind of hierarchy of life. So we're focused on tissues, a bunch of cells that are going to work together for a common function. Now, there are four primary types of tissue, and everything that you are, every tissue in your body stems from one of these four primary types. And if you have the notes printed, you can see them in the picture to the side. So the four primary types of tissue are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, so muscle, and then nervous system tissue or nervous tissue. So we actually do an entire unit on muscles and the nervous system. And so we talk about those tissue types within those units. But being in the integumentary system, it's a great opportunity to pause and talk about the first two tissue types, epithelials and connective tissues. So typically, this learning target in some classes is an entire unit, and that unit is called histology. And I'll be real honest, sometimes histology will get really boring. And so I don't love a histology unit, but I like to take the content from the histology unit and break it out into the systems where they are appropriate. So it is appropriate for us to talk about the tissues connected to epithelial and connective tissues here within the integumentary system. We'll come back to muscles and nerves when we get to those systems. So let's talk epithelial tissue first. Epithelial tissue are tissues, sheets of cells that cover the inside of our bodies and the outside of our bodies. We typically think of epithelial tissues as just being our skin on the outside, but actually all of our internal surfaces are lined with epithelial tissue as well. A key characteristic of all epithelial tissues is that they are attached to something called a basement membrane. And in this picture right here, these are various types of epithelial tissues. You can see some of it is sampled from our skin. Some of it is sampled from the surface of our lungs, the surface of our kidneys, the inside of our colon or our large intestines. But if you look in every single one of these pictures, you see this little green structure at the bottom. That is the basement membrane. So it's in every single type of epithelial tissue. It's a unifying characteristic of all epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular, which again, remember back from our LT1 unit, when we learned about the epidermis, avascular means there's no direct blood flow to the epithelial tissue, but that tissue is still living, so there must be blood flow underneath, and oxygen, CO2 can diffuse in and out of the tissue. Epithelial tissue has another characteristic of rapid healing, and that's because there's a lot of mitosis or cell division going on in epithelial cells. Typically, these cells are packed very tight together, and that means that they make direct contact with each other. They're touching. So look at all these kind of beige cells. These are the epithelial cells in these diagrams. They're all right next to neighboring cells. And so they make good borders, they make good boundaries, they do things like protect and waterproof. We'll see a few other functions as well, because a few of the epithelial tissues that we'll talk about also have these things called goblet cells embedded within the regular epithelial cells, and those are always going to produce and secrete something. So function, I'm going to list a few and then show you a couple of pictures. Protection and absorption. So protecting, we can kind of get with that, understand that because we've talked about the epidermis. Absorption, we'll see that some of the epithelial tissues are really thin, just a few layers thick, which means that absorption can occur very quickly over a short distance. If the layers aren't thick, you can diffuse pretty fast. Excreting, so pushing something out, filtering, secreting. Secreting and excreting are really two different processes. If you secrete something, you're going to release it from a cell. If you excrete something, you're usually pushing it all the way out of the tissue, usually into the bloodstream for circulation. Here are some interesting pictures of epithelial tissue. So these have been color enhanced, but these are cells lining your respiratory tract. So you can see these little interesting hair-like cilia projections. This is the surface of, I believe, your kidney. Or no, this is your your small intestines, which is really good for absorption. So the cells really look quite different, but they are all epithelial cells unified by those characteristics that we just listed prior. Now, when it comes to identifying epithelial cells, it's sort of, I liken this to receiving a name. And so epithelial tissue will have two names, a first name and a last name, if you will. The first name indicates how many layers thick the epithelial tissue is, and the last name indicates the shape of the actual cell. And so here are the options for your first name. You can either be called simple or stratified as your first name. So if you are simple, that means that you are 1 to 2 layers thick. In some cases, simple epithelial are 2 layers thick, but you're pretty thin, right? And so if you are thin and thus given the name of simple tissue, then you are going to easily move substances across your membrane, diffuse, if you remember that word from biology. So these lead to the functions that we saw before of absorption, filtration, and secretion. Here is a picture of 1 cell layer thick. Here's that basement membrane below, but 1 cell layer. So whatever this cell or this tissue type is, its first name would be called simple. Stratified means multiple layers. And so if you're multiple layers thick, you're probably good at protection. You're going to be found in high impact areas that are used frequently. So things like our skin are high impact, our epidermis is a high impact area, but also internal structures are high impact area when you think about our digestive system, food moving through it every single day, our respiratory tract. We have, we're breathing every single day. So here is a different kind of diagram, but you see multiple cell layers thick in the black, again, basement membrane to help us remember. So if you are thin, your first name is simple. If you are thick, your first name is stratified. And then remember the last name deals with the shape. So there are a couple of common shapes. Squamous, I know it's squamous or squamous is a very flat scale-like shape. Cuboidal is, as it sounds, a box, like a cube. It's as tall as it is wide. Columnar represents a column. It's very tall, shaped like a column. Here are a couple of pictures. So these are squamous cells, flat, scale-like cells. Now they're only 1 layer thick, so we would call this tissue simple squamous tissue. Here is a cube, so these are cuboidal cells. And here we see columnar cells, columns. So if we put all of that together, we can start to name some tissue. So in practicing naming, this one first, one layer thick, flat cells. What are these? Simple squamous. If we look at this one, cube or box-like, one layer thick, simple cuboidal. Down here, kind of funny shaped, but column taller than they are wide, just one layer, simple columnar. If we move over here, lots of cell layers thick, but look for the naming purposes, look at the top couple of layers. Those are similar to these. So we have over here, stratified squamous. Here again, a bunch of cell layers thick, but look towards the top to identify what the cells really should be identified as. You have stratified cuboidal, and then here, multiple layers thick, but look at the top couple of layers, you have stratified columnar. So those are the basics. There are a couple of additional interesting, two specifically interesting other epithelial tissues that we'll see. But we're going to pause in our lecture. So what I would like for you to do is create this chart in the next section of your notes. So we're going to look at the structure, function, and location of each of these types of epithelial tissue using our textbooks tomorrow in class. So you'll see familiar names: simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified squamous. Stratified cuboidal and columnars are very rare, and so we'll talk about them in class, but you're not going to actually write anything in this section of the chart, so you can write the words omit or you can just X them out. And then here are those two that really don't fit the naming pattern, but I said are interesting and we'll talk about. So add those as well. They are called pseudo-stratified columnar and transitional epithelial. So make this chart in your notes and you give yourself enough space in the chart to actually write things. So fill up that section of your notes, and we will come back to class tomorrow and we'll talk about and use our textbook to talk about the structure and function of these particular epithelial tissues. All right, you're done for today.